My name is Thomas Sterling. I'm 68 years old, and a week ago, my daughter-in-law showed up at my house with her parents, two suitcases, and the most shameless look on her face. She announced they would be living with me until they found a place of their own, without asking me, without consulting me, without even having the decency to call first. But what she didn't know is that this old man learned to set boundaries a long time ago, and her little surprise was going to last exactly 24 hours before I took action that would leave a mark on her for the rest of her life. Because while Monica, my daughter-in-law, thought she could manipulate me using my son David as an emotional shield, I had lived long enough to know exactly how to handle people who mistake kindness for weakness. And what happened next will be etched in my family's memory as the day they learned that Thomas Sterling is not the submissive old man they thought he was. Picture the scene. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was in my garden, watering the plants I've cared for so lovingly since I retired 5 years ago, when I heard the front gate open. I thought it was David coming for his usual Sunday visit, a tradition he'd kept since he married Monica 3 years ago. But when I looked up, I saw my daughter-in-law getting out of the car with two older people I didn't know, dragging suitcases behind them as if they were checking into a hotel. "Thomas," Monica said with that fake smile she uses when she wants something from me, "I'd like you to meet my parents, Robert and Helen. They're going to stay here for a few days until we find an apartment for them. I told them you're very understanding and wouldn't mind the company." I just stood there with the watering hose in my hand, staring at this surreal scene of strangers invading my home without my consent. Robert and Helen greeted me with the kind of forced politeness you see from people who know they're in an awkward situation but have no other choice. David was standing behind everyone, avoiding my gaze with the same guilty look he used to get as a kid when he broke something. But here's what Monica never saw coming. I had been through a similar situation 15 years ago with my first wife's family and had learned the hard way that when you don't set clear boundaries from the start, people will take advantage of you until there's nothing left of your peace or your dignity. This time, things were going to be different. Listen to this story to the end, because what I did that very night will leave you speechless. And tell me in the comments what country you're watching from, because this story needs to reach everyone who's had to deal with family members who don't respect boundaries. To really understand why I reacted the way I did, I need to tell you a little about my life and how I became the man I am today. I wasn't always this 68-year-old guy living alone in a 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. For 40 years, I was Thomas Sterling, a specialized HVAC technician, a man who built his reputation fixing climate control systems in businesses, hospitals, and buildings all over the city. I first got married when I was 25 to Rachel, a sweet woman who worked as a secretary in a downtown office. We had 15 very happy years together until she died in a car accident that changed my life forever. Rachel and I were never able to have children, which was a great source of pain for us, but we learned to accept it, focusing on building a full life together. After Rachel's death, I spent 5 years living alone, working day and night to keep from thinking about the emptiness in my house. My siblings worried about me. My friends tried to set me up with women, but I had no desire to fall in love again. I thought my chance at having a family had ended with Rachel. Everything changed when I met Patricia at the hospital where I maintained the air conditioning system. She was a nurse, 35 years old, and a single mother to David, who was 12 at the time. Patricia had left David's father when the boy was 8 because the man was a violent alcoholic. She had raised her son alone, working double shifts to make ends meet. I fell in love not just with Patricia, but with the chance to be a father to David. The boy needed a father figure, and I needed to feel like I had a family again. We got married when David was 14, and I legally adopted him. For the next 10 years, we were a very close-knit family. David called me Dad. I helped him with his homework. We went to football games together on Sundays. Patricia passed away from breast cancer 8 years ago. She fought for 2 years, but the disease was stronger. David was 24 when his mother died, finishing up his engineering degree and starting to build his career. I thought we would continue to be father and son, just as we'd always been, that Patricia's death would bring us closer because we were all each other had left. At first, it was that way. David came over often. We had lunch together on Sundays and talked on the phone during the week. But when he met Monica 4 years ago, Everything gradually started to change. Monica was a psychologist who worked at a mental health clinic and had very strong opinions about everything, especially family relationships. From the beginning, Monica showed a certain resistance toward me. It wasn't open hostility, but a subtle, competitive attitude, as if she saw me as an obstacle in her relationship with David. When they came to visit, she always found excuses to leave early. When I invited them for lunch, she'd suggest we meet at a restaurant because my house was too small. I realized that Monica was trying to convince David it was time for him to distance himself from me, that a man his age needed to become completely independent of his parental figures. She started saying that I was too emotionally dependent on David, that I hadn't processed my grief for Patricia correctly, and that I needed to build my own life without using my son as an emotional crutch. None of this was true. I had an active social life, hobbies I enjoyed, and friends I went out with regularly. I wasn't emotionally dependent on David any more than is normal for a father and son who love each other. But Monica had studied psychology and used her professional knowledge to create convincing narratives about my behavior. Little by little, David's visits became less frequent. First, he stopped coming every Sunday, then it was every other week, then once a month. When I called him, I'd always had some commitment with Monica or her family. When I suggested they come to my house, there was always some reason why it was better to meet somewhere else. They got married 3 years ago in a ceremony where I was an invited guest but felt like a stranger. Monica's family was large and loud and commanded all the attention at the reception. I sat at a table with some of David's co-workers whom I barely knew. Throughout the entire event, I had the feeling I was there out of obligation, not because my presence was truly wanted. After the wedding, things got worse. Monica convinced David they needed to establish clear boundaries with both of their families to build their own identity as a couple. In practice, this meant I went from seeing my son once a month to seeing him 3 or 4 times a year, always in brief, formal encounters. But what hurt the most was when David started calling me Thomas instead of Dad. Monica had explained to him that using familial terms created confusion about his adult identity and that it was healthier to establish an adult-to-adult relationship without defined parental roles. When I asked him about the change, he explained it was part of his personal growth process. For the last 3 years, I got used to this new reality. I kept my house clean and tidy in the hope that David might want to visit more often. I'd cook his favorite meals when I knew he was coming. I tried to show interest in his work and projects without being intrusive, but nothing I did seemed to change the dynamic Monica had established in our relationship. Last year, David told me he and Monica were having financial trouble. They had bought a condo that turned out to be more expensive to maintain than they'd calculated. On top of that, Monica had decided to open her own private practice, which required a significant initial investment. He asked if I could lend them some money to get through this difficult period. Of course, I lent them the money. He was my son. He was going through a tough time, and I had enough savings to help him without compromising my own financial stability. I gave them $50,000 with the agreement that they would pay me back in installments once they were back on their feet. David was deeply moved and thanked me in a way I hadn't seen in years. Over the next few months, David started visiting more often again. He'd come for lunch on Sundays like he used to. We'd talk on the phone during the week. He'd tell me about his work and his projects. I thought maybe the financial crisis had helped him realize that I was still his family, no matter what Monica said. But then I realized the visits only increased while they needed the money. Once their financial situation stabilized, David gradually pulled away again. The phone calls became less frequent. The Sunday visits grew sparse, and when I asked about the loan repayment, there was always some excuse about unexpected expenses or delays at work. 6 months ago, Monica called to tell me her parents were going through a very difficult financial situation. Robert had lost his job at 62 and couldn't find another one. Helen had health problems that required expensive medication. They had been forced to sell their house and were living in a rented apartment they could no longer afford. She told me all this with great emotional detail, emphasizing how desperate it was for her to see her parents in that situation. She explained that she and David wanted to help, but their own expenses didn't allow them to financially support 2 additional people. She asked for my advice on what they could do. I suggested several alternatives, looking into government assistance programs for senior citizens, exploring low-income housing options, connecting Robert with employment agencies specializing in older workers. I also offered to help financially as much as I could, though I made it clear that my retirement budget had its limits. Monica thanked me for my suggestions but explained that her parents were very proud people who wouldn't accept charity from the government or strangers. What they really needed was time to reorganize their lives without the pressure of paying rent every month. If they could stay temporarily with a family member, they could save money and plan for their future. That's when I started to suspect where the conversation was going. I asked her directly if she was asking me to let them live in my house. Monica acted surprised by the question and said, "Of course not. I would never be so bold as to ask you for something like that." She was just venting and wanted advice from someone with more life experience. But over the next few weeks, she started making casual comments about how big my house was for one person, how it would be nice for me to have some company at my age, how useful it could be to have Robert around because he was so handy with home repairs. They weren't direct requests, but subtle suggestions that planted the idea without committing her to an explicit ask. A month later, David called me to talk about it. He explained that his in-laws' situation had become unbearable, and they were considering moving to another city where the cost of living was lower. This would put Monica in a very difficult emotional position, as she would feel guilty for not being able to help her parents when they needed her most. David asked me to consider letting Robert and Helen stay at my house for a few months, just until they could get back on their feet. He promised they wouldn't be a burden, that they would cover all their other own expenses, help with chores, and completely respect my routine and privacy. I told him I needed time to think about it. It was a big decision that would significantly affect my daily life. I also asked why they couldn't stay in their apartment temporarily. David explained that their condo only had one bedroom, and it would be impossible to comfortably fit 4 people. After a week of reflection, I decided I could agree, but with very clear conditions. They could stay for a maximum of 3 months. They had to contribute financially to the household expenses. They had to respect my schedule and routines, and any cohabitation problems would result in them leaving immediately. David agreed to all my conditions and thanked me profusely for my generosity. But that conversation with Monica never happened. A week later, as I was mentally preparing how to lay out my conditions, Monica showed up at my house with her parents and their suitcases, assuming I had already agreed to take them in without ever bothering to confirm the details of the arrangement with me. When I saw that scene on Sunday afternoon, I realized immediately that the entire preceding conversation had been a manipulation. Monica never had any intention of formally asking for my permission or establishing clear conditions. She had used David to soften me up emotionally, but then decided to proceed unilaterally to avoid giving me the chance to set boundaries. Robert and Helen looked uncomfortable with the situation, but they were too desperate to question their daughter's methods. David avoided my gaze because he knew what was happening wasn't what we had discussed. Monica, on the other hand, acted as if everything was perfectly normal, as if I should be grateful to have company in my empty house. "Well," I said after a few moments of awkward silence, "I understand you're in a difficult situation and need help, but this isn't what David and I discussed. We need to sit down and talk about how this arrangement is going to work before you get settled." Monica replied with that condescending smile she used when she thought she had the upper hand. "Thomas, there's nothing to discuss. My parents will be here for a few months. They'll help out where they can, and we'll all get along just fine. There's no need to complicate things with rules and conditions. We're family." That's when I knew Monica had mistaken my kindness for weakness. She thought I was the typical lonely old man who would be happy to have people in the house under any circumstances. She had calculated that I wouldn't have the courage to kick out 2 vulnerable seniors, especially in front of my son. She was completely wrong. I had learned a long time ago that when someone doesn't respect your boundaries from the beginning, the situation only gets worse over time. And I had decided that I would not be a victim of family manipulation again, no matter who was involved. "All right," I said with a calmness that surprised even myself. "You can stay tonight because it's already late and not the time to be looking for a hotel. But tomorrow morning we need to have a serious conversation about how this is going to work, or you'll have to find another place to stay." That night we ate dinner in tense silence. Robert and Helen tried to make small talk about neutral topics, but you could cut the awkwardness with a knife. David helped me with the dishes after dinner and took the opportunity to apologize for how Monica had handled the situation. "Dad," he said, using the term he had abandoned for the first time in years, "I know this didn't go as we planned. Monica was just really anxious to resolve her parents' situation and got ahead of herself. But we can make this work if we all try." I explained that the problem wasn't his desire to help his in-laws. The problem was that I would not tolerate decisions about my own home being forced upon me without my consent. If he wanted this situation to work, he had to make sure his wife understood that in my house, my rules were to be respected, or there was no deal. The next morning, I called everyone for a family meeting in the dining room. I clearly explained my conditions for Robert and Helen to stay: a monthly financial contribution for household expenses, absolute respect for my routine and privacy, help with chores according to a set schedule, and a maximum stay of 3 months to find a permanent solution. Robert and Helen immediately agreed to all the conditions and thanked me for giving them the opportunity to get stable. But Monica's face was a mask of undisguised indignation. "Thomas," she said, "I think all this formality is a bit excessive. We're talking about family, not a business contract." I replied that precisely because we were family, it was important to establish clear rules to avoid misunderstandings and resentment. I also told her that if she didn't agree with the conditions, they were free to find another alternative for her parents. My house, my rules. Monica realized she didn't have many options and reluctantly agreed to the terms. We spent the rest of the morning organizing the spaces, setting up a bathroom schedule, and dividing up household responsibilities. Robert and Helen seemed relieved to have a clear framework for their stay. David looked more relaxed now that we had reached an agreement. The first few days went relatively well. Robert was a quiet, respectful man who got up early, read the newspaper on the patio, and helped me with minor maintenance tasks around the house. Helen was a pleasant woman who cooked very well and kept the kitchen spotless after every meal. They both respected my schedule and my personal space. But Monica started to show her true colors after the first week. She would show up at my house unannounced at all hours. She'd use my kitchen to cook meals that she would then take back to her own condo. She'd leave her personal belongings scattered all over the house as if she owned the place. When I asked her to respect the rules we had established, she retorted that she didn't understand why I was so rigid about unimportant details. According to her, I was displaying a very selfish mindset for a man my age, and I should be grateful to have family around. The situation worsened when Monica started inviting her siblings and their kids over for lunch at my house on the weekends. My dining room would fill up with people I didn't know who talked loudly, left a mess everywhere, and treated my home like a public event hall. When I protested, Monica told me it was only natural that she'd want to see her family when she was visiting her parents. Robert and Helen were very uncomfortable with their daughter's behavior, but they didn't dare confront her because they depended on her to resolve their housing situation. They would apologize to me in private for the liberties Monica was taking, but they couldn't do anything to control her. David was caught in the middle. On one hand, he saw that his wife was abusing my hospitality. On the other, he didn't want to create marital conflict by defending me. He tried talking to Monica several times, but she always had a psychological argument to justify her behavior. According to Monica, I was overreacting because I didn't know how to handle family living after years of being alone. My complaints about the rules were symptoms of an obsessive-compulsive personality exacerbated by age. What I needed was to learn to relax and enjoy having a house full of life. By the end of the second week, I had reached my limit. Monica had turned my home into her personal second residence. Robert and Helen felt guilty about the situation but could do nothing to change it. And David had chosen to stay on the sidelines to avoid problems with his wife. On Friday night, I made a decision that would change everything. If Monica wanted to play psychological games, I was going to teach her that she had picked the wrong opponent. Because it's one thing to help family in need and a completely different thing to allow someone to disrespect you in your own home. That night, I called my lawyer and explained the situation. I also called the local police department and asked about the procedures for removing people who had taken up residence on my property without my formal consent. I wanted to have all the necessary legal information before taking definitive action. On Saturday morning, Monica arrived at my house with two of her sisters and their respective children to have a family barbecue in my backyard. She hadn't consulted me at all. She had simply decided to use my house as the venue for her family gathering. She brought meat, charcoal, drinks, and music, as if she were hosting a party at her own place. When I saw her unloading all the things from her car, I knew the time had come. I told her I needed to speak with her in private before more people arrived. Monica replied that we could chat all I wanted after the meal, but right now she was busy organizing the family lunch. I explained that there wasn't going to be any family lunch at my house because I had not authorized this gathering. I asked her to pack everything up and take her family somewhere else. Monica laughed as if I told a joke and told me not to be ridiculous, that a little barbecue never hurt anyone. In that moment, I knew that words were no longer going to work. Monica had decided that my opinion about what happened in my own home was irrelevant. She had interpreted my hospitality as her right and believed she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. I went inside my house, called the police, and explained that I had people on my property who were refusing to leave after I had asked them to. I told them I needed police assistance to enforce my right as a homeowner to decide who could and could not be in my house. Half an hour later, two police officers arrived. Monica became hysterical when she saw the patrol car parked in front of my house. She shouted at the officers that it was all a misunderstanding, that they were family, that I was having age-related behavioral problems. But when the officers asked for my side of the story, I showed them the property deed to the house and explained that I had formally requested these individuals to leave my property. The officers explained to Robert, Helen, and Monica's entire family that as the homeowner, I had the absolute right to decide who was allowed on my property. If I asked them to leave, they had to go immediately, or they could be charged with trespassing. Robert and Helen began gathering their belongings without protest. They understood perfectly that the situation had become untenable because of their daughter's behavior. They apologized for all the trouble and thanked me for helping them during the weeks they had stayed with me. Monica, however, started screaming that I was crazy, that I was a bitter old man, and that David was going to hear about how cruel I had been to her family. The officers told her to control her tone and respect the owner's rights. David arrived in the middle of all this chaos. When he saw the police and his family packing their things, he didn't know whether to be furious with me or ashamed of his wife's behavior. He asked me how things had escalated to this point and why I hadn't tried to resolve it differently. I explained that I had tried to resolve things civilly for 2 weeks, but that his wife had chosen to ignore every rule we had established. When someone doesn't respect your home, your boundaries, and your dignity, there is no other option but to take firm action. David tried to convince me to give them a second chance, that things could change if everyone put in more effort, but my decision was made. I told him the doors to my house would always be open to him, but that Monica had proven she did not know how to behave as a guest and was therefore no longer welcome in my home. That afternoon, after everyone had left, I was alone in my house, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because I had reclaimed my peace and my personal space. Sadness because I knew my relationship with David would be damaged, at least temporarily. But I also felt a sense of pride for having defended my dignity. For years, I had tolerated Monica's manipulative behavior because I didn't want to cause problems in my son's life. But I had reached a point where tolerating disrespect had become more costly than facing the consequences of setting clear boundaries. That night, David called me to talk. He said he understood my frustration, but felt I had overreacted. According to him, the issues could have been resolved with more communication and patience without involving the police. I explained it hadn't been an impulsive decision. For 2 weeks, I had tried to communicate with Monica about the problems, but she had systematically ignored all my concerns. Calling the police was the last resort after exhausting all other options for dialogue. I also told him something I'd been thinking for months, that his marriage to Monica had changed our relationship in a way that didn't make me happy. She had established a dynamic where I was seen as an interference in their life as a couple, and he had accepted that dynamic without defending the place I held in his life as his father. David was quiet for a long time after hearing this. Finally, he said he would think about everything I'd said but needed time to process the situation. He asked me not to make any final decisions about our relationship until we could talk more calmly. For the next 2 weeks, I heard nothing from David or Monica. Robert called me once to thank me again for the help and to tell me they had found a small apartment they could afford on their limited income. He also apologized for his daughter's behavior and said that he and Helen were very embarrassed by the whole situation. On the third Sunday after the incident, David showed up at my house unannounced. He came alone, without Monica, with a look on his face I hadn't seen since his mother died. He sat on the sofa where he used to sit as a teenager to tell me about his problems at school. "Thomas," he said, using my name again instead of Dad, "I came to apologize and to tell you something you need to know." He told me that over the past few weeks, he had been reflecting a lot on everything that had happened and realized I was right about many things. After the incident with the police, he and Monica had several huge arguments about her behavior at my house. David had started to question things he had previously accepted without a second thought, especially the way Monica spoke about me and treated our father-son relationship. Monica had told him that I was a manipulative old man who had used her parents' situation to humiliate her publicly in front of her family. According to her, calling the police was revenge because I felt displaced in their married life. She had painted me as a resentful man who couldn't accept that David no longer needed me as a father figure. But David had started to see the contradictions in that narrative. If I was so manipulative and vengeful, why had I agreed to help her parents in the first place? If I had trouble accepting his independence, why had I respected his decision to distance himself for years after he got married? He had also spoken with Robert and Helen about what really happened at my house. They told him a very different version of events. They explained that I had been extremely generous and patient, that I had set reasonable rules for living together, and that it was Monica who had systematically violated every agreement. David asked me to tell him my complete version of what had happened without leaving out any details. He wanted to understand exactly how things had escalated to the point of calling the police. I explained everything from the beginning, the way Monica had handled the situation, the rules we had established, the systematic violations of those rules, and my frustration at seeing my request for respect ignored. When I finished my side of the story, David was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Thomas, I think for years I let Monica convince me that being a good husband meant pushing you away. But now I realize that what really happened was I traded a father who loved me unconditionally for a wife who loves me only when I do what she expects." That conversation was a turning point. David started visiting more often. He started calling me Dad again. He began to question Monica's opinions on family matters and told me about problems in his marriage I never knew about. He said Monica had a very controlling personality that extended to every aspect of their life. She decided how they spent their money, which friends they could see, how they spent their weekends, and even what clothes were appropriate for him to wear to work. David had accepted all of this, believing it was normal in a partnership, but now he was beginning to understand it was a form of manipulation. He also told me Monica had been pressuring him to ask me for more money. According to her, I had enough savings to help them buy a bigger house, and it was selfish of me not to offer that help spontaneously. She had developed a narrative where I had a moral obligation to finance their life projects because they were my only family. David had resisted this pressure because something told him it wasn't right, but Monica kept insisting that a father who truly loved his son would make any sacrifice to ensure his happiness and financial success. Over the following months, I watched as David began to reclaim his individual personality after years of living under Monica's influence. He started making decisions without consulting her on everything. He started expressing opinions that didn't align with his wife's. He started defending our time together when she tried to sabotage it with excuses. This created a lot of conflict in their marriage. Monica couldn't understand why David had changed so much. She accused him of being under my negative influence, of regressing to a childish mentality where I was still the primary authority in his life. One day, David came to my house with news that surprised me, but which deep down I had been expecting. He told me that he and Monica were getting a divorce. The relationship had become unsustainable because they could no longer agree on any important issue, especially everything related to our father-son relationship. Monica had given him an ultimatum. Either he cut off all contact with me or she would file for divorce. According to her, she couldn't be married to a man who allowed his father to interfere in their marriage. David had chosen to maintain our relationship and accept the consequences. I felt terrible for being the cause of his marital problems, but I also felt relieved to know my son had chosen not to sacrifice our relationship to please a manipulative wife. I told him I would support him in whatever he decided. The divorce process was very difficult for David. Monica used every emotional manipulation tactic she knew to try to make him change his mind. She accused him of being an immature man who couldn't cut the umbilical cord. She told him I had brainwashed him against her. She threatened to ruin his professional reputation. During those tough months, David spent a lot of time at my house. We talked about his future, about the lessons he'd learned, and about how his mother, Patricia, would never have allowed anyone to interfere in our relationship. A year after the separation, David told me he had started dating a woman named Carmen, an engineer at his company. Carmen was very different from Monica, independent, respectful, and with no interest in controlling or manipulating her partner. She had also lost her father when she was young, so she understood the importance of healthy family relationships. When David introduced me to Carmen, I was impressed by her maturity and authenticity. She didn't try to impress me or force my approval. She was just herself, an intelligent woman who genuinely wanted to know her boyfriend's family. She asked real questions about my life, my hobbies, my work, showing genuine interest in me as a person. Carmen told me David had talked a lot about me and everything we'd been through. She completely agreed with his philosophy that a partner should never interfere with healthy family bonds. Over the next few months, I developed a wonderful relationship with Carmen. She and David came for lunch every Sunday. She'd help me in the garden and bring me books she thought I might like. Most importantly, she completely respected my relationship with David, never trying to compete for his attention or loyalty. One day, Carmen asked me something that made me reflect deeply. "Thomas, do you regret calling the police that day? Do you think you could have handled it differently?" I explained that I'd thought about that question many times. On one hand, it was an extreme measure that caused a family crisis. On the other, it was the only way to make Monica understand that I had non-negotiable limits. If I hadn't taken that drastic step, her disrespectful behavior would have continued to escalate until my house was her territory. David would have never questioned his marriage, and I would have ended up a stranger in my own home. Besides, I told Carmen, that situation taught me something important. It showed me that at 68 years old, I still had the strength to defend my dignity. That lesson was invaluable. Carmen nodded. "I think you did the right thing," she said. "Sometimes you have to take strong measures for people to understand you're serious." 6 months ago, David and Carmen got engaged. He asked for my blessing before proposing, and I gave it with great joy. Carmen had proven for 2 years that she understood and valued family. Now we're planning the wedding for next year. Carmen wants the ceremony to be in my backyard, the very same place where 3 years ago I had to call the police to defend my dignity. It feels symbolic that a space that was the scene of such conflict will now be where we celebrate a new beginning for our family. Over these past 3 years, I've learned that kindness should never be confused with submission. You can be a good, loving person without letting others abuse your goodness. I also learned that setting clear boundaries from the start is much easier than trying to establish them after someone is already used to disrespecting you. And sometimes, you have to risk a relationship to save it. When I called the police, I knew I could lose my relationship with David forever. But I also knew that if I didn't, I would lose my dignity and self-respect, which would have been far worse. Last year, I started giving talks at community centers for senior citizens about the importance of setting family boundaries. Many people my age go through similar situations, and I share my story as an example that it's never too late to defend your dignity. We all deserve respect, no matter our age. The most important lesson I've learned is that true family is the one that respects you, supports you, and values you for who you are. Any relationship based on manipulation, control, or disrespect isn't family. It's an emotional burden you have no obligation to carry. And that lesson, believe me, is worth more than keeping the peace at any price. If you are listening to this story and identify with any part of it, I want you to know that it's never too late to defend your dignity. Your home is your territory, your sacred space, where you have the absolute right to decide who can and cannot be there. People who truly respect you will understand and accept your limits. The people who get angry when you set boundaries are the very people you need to protect yourself from. Respect is not something you negotiate. It's something you demand and defend. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to take drastic measures to defend your space or your dignity. And above all, let me know what country you are listening from, because I want this message of empowerment to reach every corner of the world. Thanks for listening to Whispers of Experience. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.